Meanwhile, in the fall, winter, and spring, Antioch Theatre still did not have a home. Describing the operations of the Yellow Springs Area Theatre, Paul Treichler wrote in an updating assessment, "In 1949, the state of Ohio, through its building inspectors, officially and forever closed the doors of the Yellow Springs Opera House which housed us. What Brooks Atkinson called one of the half-dozen best theater buildings in the United States now sees and hears only the mice and the pigeons, the bats and the owls with whom we had for 15 years amiably cohabitated. Whether or not we can convert the Foundry building we will occupy in May into a theater in time for the coming summer is a question we are at the moment in the midst of answering. Meanwhile, we are operating the winter program with excitement, financial success, and galloping schizophrenia in the Women's Gymnasium at Antioch College, the Dayton Art Institute, and in spare closets, cellars, garages, stair landings, and spaces behind the plaster." While Antioch Theatre was still without a home, the prospect on the horizon, if they could raise sufficient funds, $295,000, was exciting indeed. In the shell of the former Morris Bean Foundry, built at the beginning of the Second World War, architect George F. Shantz was asked to design a movable stage configuration that was simple in concept, but, to quote Treichler in a slick, enticing brochure that laid out the details for the new theater, revolutionary in its implications. "We refuse to accept the idea that the Antioch Area Theatre would have to turn its back on the contributions made by Margot Jones and Glenn Hughes, Frederick McConnell, Joe Melziner, Stanley McCandless, and Adolph Appia, or even Henrik Ibsen or William Shakespeare, who exploited the physical properties of the stage in his time." Treichler quoted Adolph Appia, the pioneer of modern stagecraft. "How can dramatic art be completely reformed without first reforming the place where the art develops? The stage is always ready for new arrangement and must, in consequence, be adapted to continual change." Paul's concept, architecturally worked out by Shantz and worked into a scale model with movable parts by Bud Steinhilber, was brilliant in concept, and had it been fully executed would have been an extraordinarily inventive space for playwrights, actors, and directors. The concept was relatively simple. There would be 15 to 30 seats permanently mounted on movable platforms, with a total seating capacity of 530 seats. These freestanding units could then be moved around by crane to create any number of imaginative seating arrangements. But moving into the space did not happen as planned. In May of '53, the college never did raise enough money to realize Treichler's vision, and when they finally did move in 1955, all they had was the shell of the Foundry, and what they devised could only hint at the transformative space that Treichler had envisioned. In the fall of '52, in the spring of '53, my father taught speech, classes in acting and directing, and a class for acting on television, even though few people had one. Over the fall and spring terms, he directed and acted in Shaw's The Devil's Disciple, played Napoleon in a reading of Shaw's Man of Destiny, and acted in Treichler's play about Horace Mann, Testament of Faith, in which Lithgow played Mann, a part he first played as a student at Antioch. Around this time, Paul was refining a theory of styles in theater, out of which would come his influential and legendary course by that name, always taught at 8 in the morning. Although the various styles talked about in the class were structured somewhat historically, classicism to surrealism, his underlying vision was that styles were in essence ahistorical, that they did different kinds of psychological and emotional work and created meaning in different ways. Paul believed that each style acted distinctively on the human nervous system, in everyday life as well as in the theater. His lecture on each style, as the ash on a cigarette grew longer and longer, included film which, while not live theater, was sufficient to illustrate specific styles. To name just a few: Tyrone Guthrie's Stratford production of Oedipus Rex for classicism, a filmed Shakespeare play for romanticism, Pere Lorenz's 1938 documentary The River for impressionism, and for surrealism, An Andalusian Dog, the 1929 silent film by Luis Buñuel and Salvador Dali. Each style, said Treichler, carried with it a particular configuration of theatrical production and performance: set, stage, layout, lighting, language, gesture, costume, and all the rest. An individual may feel affinity with some styles and resist others. Paul told of a student who fled the classroom and nearly fainted from watching Oedipus Rex. But when the eyeball is sliced in An Andalusian Dog, she didn't turn a hair and said she loved the film. Paul consulted with scientists to explore his vision through measuring audience responses. During the second season of the Shakespeare Festival, my father played Painter in Timon of Athens, Aaron the Moor in Titus Andronicus, Mark Antony in both Julius Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra, and directed Coriolanus and Pericles. In the fall of '53 and spring of '54, he taught classes, directed Christopher Fry's verse play, The Lady's Not for Burning, in which he also played the male lead, Thomas Mendip, directed Giancarlo Manotti's Christmas opera, A Mole and the Night Visitors, and acted in Centennial Review and Street Scene. Because my father was also building an actor's resume, he was not with the Shakespeare Festival in the summer of '54. Instead, he acted at the Hyde Park Playhouse in Hyde Park, New York, where he reprised Thomas Mendip in The Lady's Not for Burning, played Mr. Billy Dimple in Royal Tyler's 18th century farce, The Contrast, played Henry Higgins in Pygmalion, Papa and Samuel Taylor's The Happy Time, and one of the three convicts in Samuel and Bella Spaywack's comedy, My Three Angels. In the summer of '55, back with the Shakespeare Festival, he directed As You Like It and Cymbeline and played the host to The Merry Wives of Windsor, Charles the Wrestler in As You Like It, Macduff in Macbeth, the First Gentleman in Cymbeline, and Malvolio in Twelfth Night. During one performance of Twelfth Night, it rained off and on. It was always an adventure in the rain, my father told me. There was a large canvas awning they'd pull out over the middle section of the audience that left those on the sides unprotected. When they'd roll out the awning, those sitting on the sides would crowd in towards the middle, and those in the front seats would scamper onto the edge of the stage to huddle in under the canvas that stretched over the actors. When it rained enough, the canvas between the cables that kept it aloft would belly down. To prevent a deluge, stagehands would then stab holes in the canvas with knives to drain the gathered water. When it rained hard, cast and audience would move inside the main building, where a makeshift stage had been assembled. They were sold out that night. Because of the rain, the performance had been stop and start. The people were so marvelous, my father told me. They'd pick up props and carry them inside, or if they'd been inside, they'd carry them out. The box office offered a rain check to anyone who wanted one, but there were no takers. Finally, after a couple of treks in and out to the main building, and the audience huddling in under the canvas and spilling onto the stage, they announced that if it rained again, the cast would play through. In their last migration to the outside stage, my father spotted a woman in this joyous, gossiping flow of humanity, holding a closed, brightly colored, frilly umbrella. He asked if he could borrow it. They had stopped the play just before Malvolio's entrance when Sir Toby Belch, Sir Andrew Aguecheek, and Feste the Clown are out in the street bellowing and waking Malvolio. My father entered in Malvolio's nightshirt with a frilly umbrella opened. What he hadn't noticed when it was closed was a frilly cupola-like adornment floating just below the umbrella's finial. The woman had given him the perfect prop. The rain had created the perfect circumstance, and Shakespeare had given him the perfect line. "My masters, are you mad, or what are you?" David Hooks, who was playing Feste, just collapsed, and the whole house went in an uproar. It was marvelous. You had to kind of step between the people to get on. But it was an absolute celebration. It was a magnetic night. It was wonderful. In 1956, the Antioch Theatre Department launched a satellite project in Trotwood, Ohio, a farming community just outside of Dayton. Trotwood Circle Theatre, constructed inside a large barn donated by Mark Shellhouse, the superintendent of Trotwood Madison Schools, would provide summer employment for Antioch theater majors for years to come. In 1952, back when Lithgow was trying to put together the company for the first season, when everyone thought they'd only be mounting the history plays, someone suggested that Lithgow take a look at a student playing Hamlet in a Carnegie Tech production. He drove over to Pittsburgh to check him out. He wasn't impressed. He was, however, impressed with the tall, 6'3" willowy fellow playing the player king, Ellis Rabb. Rabb had only completed his junior year when Lithgow hired him as an apprentice. He'd come from a state-of-the-art theater school that had everything. Antioch had little more than outsized ambition and a can-do spirit. According to Dorothy Lamming, a friend of Rabb's, an actress with the company, and someone who would later write her Ph.D. dissertation on the actor, Rabb arrived at Antioch young, spoiled, and impatient. Now this pampered boy was expected to hang lights and help build the set. He was not pleased. Rabb played small parts that first summer, until the last play of the season, when he took on the role of Cardinal Wolsey in King Henry VIII. His Wolsey was a triumph. Critics lavished him with praise. Rabb's success that first summer allowed him to lower his guard. The young man who had at first come off as spoiled and impatient now revealed himself as a warm, affectionate human being, an incredible talent with an outrageous sense of humor. In 1953, Rabb took on two large roles, Troilus in Troilus and Cressida, and Cassius in Julius Caesar. He struggled with Troilus, never felt he got it right, and the critics who praised his Wolsey the summer before were unmerciful in their reviews. But praise for his Cassius was universal, a salve to his bruised ego. Lithgow by now had taken Rabb under his wing, and Rabb was an eager student. Every man has a dragon in his life he must slay, or be slain by, Lithgow told him. You must face your dragon. Rabb, according to Lamming, needed to acquire an objectivity around criticism. he trusted Lithgow to show him how to do it. Lithgow's ability to conceptualize and bring his concepts to the stage fueled Rab's intellectual and creative instincts. Around Lithgow's kitchen table, Lithgow and Rab worked, planned, talked, and argued late into the night. Their relationship as mentor and mentee was evolving into a creative and trusting friendship. In their late-night conversations, each became a sounding board for the other. Rab's two largest roles in the 54 season were Capulet in Romeo and Juliet and Ariel in The Tempest. That he play Ariel was Rab's idea. Lithgow was against it. Rab was adamant. Over the fall, winter, and spring, letters flew back and forth. Rab finally threatened to quit if he didn't get the part. Lithgow relented. Rab's Ariel, by all reports, was masterful. He ended the third season as he had the first, on a wave of success. In 55, Rab played Justice Shallow in The Merry Wives of Windsor, Touchstone in As You Like It, Sir Andrew Aguecheek in Twelfth Night, an old man in Macbeth, Palamon in Two Noble Kinsmen, and took on the jealous Mercurial Leontes in The Winter's Tale. So imaginative, my father described Rab to me when I interviewed him in 79. The main thing was trying to help him make decisions. He'd have 60 things going at once. It was a matter of helping him pare that down. In 56, with the festival's ambition approaching completion, an entrepreneurial group of businessmen from Toledo who wanted a Shakespeare festival in their city approached Lithgow with a plan to share the concluding Shakespeare season with them. There'd be two companies, one working out of Yellow Springs, the other out of a 1,900-seat amphitheater in Toledo's Zoological Gardens. While one company would be performing one play in Toledo, the other company would be performing a different play in Yellow Springs. Then the companies would switch venues and remount their productions. The actors from the two companies would never cross paths. The Toledo group would sponsor the 4 plays originating there: Hamlet, A Comedy of Errors, Love's Labour's Lost, and All's Well That Ends Well. Antioch would sponsor the 3 plays originating in Yellow Springs: Much Ado About Nothing, King Lear, and Measure for Measure. With 2 companies, Lithgow would have to hire twice as many actors, but Antioch would take on less than half the financial burden. The massive theater in Toledo would add almost 1,000 seats, and having 2 venues would allow twice as much rehearsal time and give actors the luxury of performing 2 straight weeks with each play, 1 week in Yellow Springs, another in Toledo, to ripen into their roles. For the most part, the plan worked, though traveling back and forth did wear on the actors. Because the season had become so complicated with so many working parts, in 1956 Lithgow took a leave of absence from his teaching duties at the college. Ellis Rab directed Measure for Measure and was cast as Benedict in Much Ado About Nothing. It came as a shock to him that he was not cast as Hamlet. No one doubted but that this role was unquestionably his, wrote Lamming. Instead, Lithgow brought in Michael Higgins from New York for the part, and asked Rab, who was now all of 26, to play King Lear. Rab was distraught. He questioned whether Lithgow had lost his senses, but the decision proved to be the masterstroke of the entire festival. Rab's performance was praised by Henry Hughes in Saturday Review as possessing the finish, brilliance, and intelligence of Sir John Gielgud. About the entire production he concluded, under Mr. Lithgow's purposeful direction, The Antioch production of King Lear is certainly the best American production of the play in our time. Judson Jerome, poet and Antioch professor, wrote in Shakespeare Quarterly that Raymond Massey saw it in Toledo and Backstage told Rab that he had been seeing Lear since 1909 and that this was the best yet. Rab sees Lear, continued Jerome, as a tottering king entered upon the peevishness and jealousy and self-centeredness of his second childhood, until garment by garment he is stripped by adversity to the bare man. Only then at Dover, fully aware of the bestiality of man, is he able to rise to man's full dignity. And I tell you, when Rab raises his naked arm 10 feet in the air and says with a belladonna clarity of madness, "Aye, every inch a king," the audience shudders. It is a moment in stage history. With the festival completed in '56, audiences' appetites had been whetted for more. But what that more would be was the question. Audiences were polled by a survey that had been slipped into their programs and were full of suggestions. Repeat the canon chronologically, repeat the plays from a particular season, or mount a season of plays by Sophocles, Moliere, or Shaw. The plan finally settled upon was not altogether Lithgow's. The college wanted ownership of the magnificent thing that Lithgow had created, and they took it. The season of plays finally settled upon proved neither artistically nor financially successful. So for the first time in its brief roaring history, Shakespeare Under the Stars ended its final season in the red. Why Arthur Lithgow left Yellow Springs and Antioch in the heels of that failed season is not, I think, as mysterious as it has been felt by many over the years. As a staff writer wrote in a Springfield newspaper, "Easy to understand, but hard to adjust to." Like Alexander the Great, Mr. Lithgow fretted because there seemed no more fields to conquer. He produced all of the works of William Shakespeare. What he set out to do, he did. Now there seemed nothing left for him to do, at least not at Antioch. According to a student paper by Peg Archibald, What Happened to Shakespeare, written for a historian and Western civilization class in 1959, ADSL, the college's democratically elected governing body, and a theater subcommittee had the dominant role in shaping the '57 season. The theater department wanted more students in the productions, especially since, beginning in '58, the student schedule would shift, with half the student body studying on campus over the summer. The theater department demanded a closer connection between the winter and summer programs. Lithgow stated flatly that, whatever the resultant problems, I have from the first pressed for a vigorous growth of professionalism. I have felt that the audiences demanded it, the plays themselves required it, and the participating students most directly benefited by it. The subcommittee recommended that the next 3 seasons be devoted to a combination of Shakespeare plays, together with other classical productions. Lithgow wanted to remount Richard II, Henry IV, Parts 1 and 2, and Henry V. His suggestions were tossed in favor of more popular fare: Julius Caesar, Twelfth Night, Henry VIII, and A Midsummer Night's Dream. Lithgow had lost artistic control to the democratic deliberations of the institution. The music-oriented lyric productions that originated out of Toledo in '57, The Rape of Lucretia by Benjamin Britten, The Soldier's Tale by Igor Stravinsky, Trouble in Tahiti by Leonard Bernstein, and Lost in the Stars, book by Maxwell Anderson, music by Kurt Weill, proved too modern, too atonal to draw an audience. The director put in charge of the Toledo productions Benno Frank, a German expat who had earlier directed for the festival, was hired in spite of Lithgow's objections, and was generally assessed afterwards to have been a bad choice. My father oversaw the casting of the Shakespeare productions. He was scheduled to be the artistic director of the Shakespeare plays. Lithgow's role in the summer of '57 was to oversee the entire festival, both productions in Yellow Springs and Toledo. Casting the Shakespeare plays involved holding auditions in New York. Though all the actors they auditioned, over 200, had been pre-screened, the vast majority of them, according to my father, weren't very good. You had to have fairly big voices out there. We were doing it in a kind of grand style. Lithgow was not pleased with the results. There was a rearranging of parts, and salaries had to be renegotiated. The upshot: Lithgow fired my father from the festival altogether. When my father looked back on it 20 years later, it was all a bit fuzzy in his head. My father knew the festival was Arthur's baby. He also knew an undertaking that large demands unfettered ambition and precise oversight. What I'm saying, my father told me in 1979, is that I'm really conscious of the difficulty of Arthur's job, and I can understand in a frantic way of wanting to be on top of the whole thing. While my father's ego was bruised, even 2 decades later he couldn't help but look back at his time with Arthur with deep affection. It was a very rich relationship, the friendship I had with him, and the many richnesses of the theater he brought, his imagination, his programming imagination, and daring to pull all of that off. It was a phenomenal event. Lithgow put Ellis Rabb in charge of the Shakespeare part of the festival instead. My gut thought, looking back at what Arthur must have felt himself up against in the summer of '57, is that he was losing control of the festival. The baby he conceived and brought into the world was changing into something else, something practical that could bring in money and perpetuate itself, a thing far removed from his dream. His putting Rabb, his excellent student who had matured into an actor's actor, in charge of the Shakespeare portion of the festival, feels to me now like a Hail Mary pass, a futile effort to somehow pull back the thing that was rushing from him. Lithgow's dream probably hadn't materialized off the endorphins stimulated by productions of Shaw and Martha's Vineyard, nor even the roaring success of the Chronicle plays in '52. More likely the dream had been brewing in his head since he was a child, huddled away in his mother's attic, escaping the sorrows and drudgery of the nursing home below, to drift on the fantastical worlds that Shakespeare's words had painted in his head. The child that had no father and found salvation in Shakespeare had, through the mounting of all of Shakespeare's plays, fathered himself. Though now himself a father with 4 children of his own to look after, the thought of staying on at Antioch was too painful to imagine. So with no plan in sight, the Lithgows one night packed up like a family of gypsies and left Yellow Springs for the empty house Arthur and Sally had purchased on a whim on Martha's Vineyard.